I know you want to just jump right into it, and so do I, but first I have to tell you that the Online League Series is the only open tournament that I know of going on this weekend, and it is played in the same format as Duels of Runeterra, so it'll be really good practice going into next weekend, where you have to play in that qualifier to try to get your way into the Invitational. It only plays out in one day, it's only a Saturday tournament, so you don't have to commit Sunday to it as well. Highly recommend trying it out. Just because it'll be really, really good practice to have a little bit of tournament experience under your belt going into such a big event. So there's a fair amount to cover this week, and my tournament tier list kind of goes out the window because there's a new format. It would be wild to recycle the same tier list or try to rearrange those decks, or place decks from ladder kind of randomly on there based on their perceived power level. So instead I'm going to focus on what I can do, and there are a lot of things I want to talk about. The first are the three major players of the tournament format. We're talking Swain, Ezreal, Aurelion Sol. I think those are definitely, like, it's very possible that you're going to run into a lineup with those three champions. An Aurelion Sol deck, a Swain deck, and an Ezreal deck. What you can do to navigate that, which deck you should be picking on out of those. But first, what I want to talk about is the three major Targon decks that I think we see, which are Nightfall Aggro, Allegiance Aurelion Sol, and Freljord Aurelion Sol. And Leona can be thrown in there somewhere, but I think if you're going to see a Leona deck this weekend, it's going to be paired with Aurelion Sol. I know that Leona Swain is a thing, but I think there are better versions of Swain. And of course, Ezreal is alive and well. He might not be doing super hot on ladder, but Ezreal's always been a lot more prevalent in tournament than it has on ladder. And yeah, I know that Spell Shield came out, but guess what? That's just deny. Ezreal decks have beaten deny decks in the past. It's not that hard. That said, I mean, what are you going to do? Drop an Aurelion Sol on turn 10? I will respond with Karma and Ezreal. You have 3 mana left to do, oh, that's right, nothing, because there's not a lot of removal in an Aurelion Sol deck, and even if there was, you have 3 mana. What are you going to do? What are you talking about? Also, I don't really see, like, I'm seeing, like, one of Bastion's index. Maybe that changes for tournaments. It's kind of hard to say, but at the end of the day, like, it's basically just a deny, which is a fancy way of saying it's, you know, Ezreal decks can beat it. That said, I mean, like the 5/5 Spell Shield Dragon not seeing a lot of play. The fact that Aurelion Sol has Spell Shield is largely irrelevant because I'm probably ending the game the same turn you're playing Aurelion Sol. So that just kind of is what it is. But let's get started with the A-Sol decks, because when I go to talk about Nightfall aggro, I'll also talk about what a 3 aggro lineup looks like. So first off, we have the Shadow Isle Allegiance Diana Aurelion Sol deck out of Winding God. I see this deck a lot on ladder. The problem that you're going to run into with this is not only are you a little bit weak in the early game, and by a little bit weak, I mean extremely weak. I mean, look at this. Let's say you're going up against the Fearsome deck, right? We have 2 attack, 1 attack, 2 attack. That one's got 3 attack, 2 attack, 1 attack, 2 attack, 2 attack. There's actually only 1 unit in your entire deck that can Fearsome block on the first couple of turns. Obviously, level Diana can do it as well, but you don't really want to be blocking with Diana. You want to be attacking and taking out the units with the Challenger Diana. But, I mean, you are obviously extremely weak to an aggro plan like that, and I've been heard that you're weak in Aurelion Sol mirrors as well. Anything that can kill your Mountain Scryer is actually going to have a decent shot against you, and you are a little bit dependent on what Celestials you can actually hit, playing those properly, things like that. There are a lot of Celestials that kind of auto-end games on their own, so it's a really weird deck to like sit here and try to conceptualize for you, because the Celestials that you get do really swing the way a matchup goes, and it's not even which one you pick, it's which ones are presented to you. You know, it is possible that you just low roll on your Celestials and you get bodied by, you know, pretty much anything. But, you know, it does have a lot of things going for it. It does have a lot of Celestial generation. The Ruination can be a blowout card. Unspeakable Horrors turned out to be pretty good. Just the sort of Nightfall backup plan to maintain advantage and try to have a little bit of agency in the early game is, you know, it works out in a couple of matchups, doesn't work out in a couple of other ones. If you are worried about aggro, then you can go for a list looking a little bit more like what BBG has done, where instead of the Nightfall backup plan goes for the Daylight backup plan, which works out a little bit better against aggro. You know, you do have the Solari soldiers in the early game. You have Radiant Guardian to go ahead and gain back a little bit of life, single combat on combination with the Radiant Guardian, and just the Leona effect in general to stun out your opponent's board and go a little bit harder. You don't have as much Celestial generation. I think that's why we do see the 3 copies of the Infinite Mind Splitter, as well as it's important to remember that if something doesn't use the stack, then it gets around Spell Shield, and the Infinite Mind Splitter, unlike Yone, does not use the stack. Neither does Frostbite, neither does Swain Stun, and that's one of the big reasons that we're seeing so much Swain right now, on top of the fact that it's a good deck with a wide spread of matchups, is that it does get around Spell Shield. So If I have Outswain or Leviathan and you drop Aurelion Soul and then I drop the other piece of my combo and we're going into my attack turn, there's a very good chance that I just kill you because your free Celestials mean nothing given that all of them are slow speed except for the one that fills your hand with Celestials, which doesn't really matter if I'm killing you that turn. That's more or less what these Allegiance Targon decks are looking like. They feel kind of cut and dry in their matchups. They're bad against aggro. They're okay against mid-range. They're good against control. There's really not much else to say about it. Now you know what the decks look like at least, right? Now this is a sample ramp Aurelion Soul deck. We're seeing Nola Gold bust this one out tonight in the Reckoning Fight Night, and this one is going to win the Aurelion Soul Mirror. You don't have a lot of removal in Targon, especially the Aurelion Soul deck, so my Face is the Old One's going to stick, my Wording Stone's going to stick, obviously Catalyst is going to pop off, I have Dragon's Clutch to make sure I consistently hit ASOL on 10. I don't have a lot of removal for your Mountain Scryer, but I think that's fine. I mean, I can take a turn off to Sunburst on like turn 7 or 8 while I'm on 7 or 8 mana, not necessarily turn 7 or 8. And I'm just going to hit my ASOL before you do it. It's pretty simple. It's pretty cut and dry. My ASOL will eventually outvalue you while you're constantly playing cards to get your Celestials and then playing your Celestials for cost. You know, you don't have great ways to remove my board. Although I will say the Infinite Mind Splitter is sort of something that this deck probably has to keep around in order to actually level the Aurelion Soul. I obviously don't have a lot of Celestial generation outside of this, and a couple of my cards have 0 attack. So the one difficulty I could run into is actually leveling that Aurelion Soul. I think that's where Star Shaping comes in really big. Obviously, I have the Revitalizing Roar to also make my Aurelion Soul cost 0, as well as gain back 10 life. And overall, I think this is going to do a little bit better against aggro. It really comes down to how much value can I get off of my Avalanche, how much healing do I have available. The answer is a lot between the Catalysts and the Star Shaping. But yeah, I like this deck a fair amount, not a lot. I do personally prefer the Allegiance version, but just so you know what you're looking at when you go up against a Trundle ASOL, I do want to say that this deck is a little bit subtypical as we kind of expect out of Nola Gold. I've never seen anyone run Troll Scavenger or Troll Ravager in this, but because this is the first iteration that's going into a tournament, it's possible that this is what's going to be net decked over the course of the tournament weekend. But the same concepts are there. You play Faces, you play Catalyst, you just ramp into the ASOL, you get that down, you get it done. You're still weak to aggro. So speaking of aggro, let's talk about this Diana Nocturne deck. It's an aggro deck. What did you think I was going to have to say about it? I mean, you know what the Nightfall... As long as you know what the Nightfall cards do, and just the Targon cards in general, it's just an aggro deck. There's nothing super incredible about it. It's just fearsome aggro. You know, it is what it is. Lunari Priestess comes in, which is pretty cool because the Celestials can really shake up a couple of matchups. Stalking Shadows is a card that just slots into pretty much every Shadow Isle deck. I think that Deep is actually going to absolutely love that card. I'm not going to talk that much about Deep this week, but I do think that like Stalking Shadows is a great Deep card, so just kind of keep that in the back of your head, I guess. But yeah, there's actually, I don't really have much to say about this. It's an aggro deck. It just kind of is what it is. But I do want to talk about a 3 aggro lineup. So obviously the buffs to Zaunite Urchin and Sump Dredger came out last weekend, which means that Casino has a little bit more agency, but more importantly, discard aggro. So if you were to run something like this Diana Nocturne deck, discard aggro, and then an aggressive Demacia deck, you've got a 3 aggro lineup. And I think you've got a pretty good shot at picking on the Aurelion Soul decks that your opponents are bringing, if that is something that you think is going to be brought en masse. It's kind of hard to say. Looking at the Fight Night deck list, there are a lot of Aurelion Souls, but these are also players that are well established. You know, they're not necessarily hurting to go win a tournament and prove themselves. A lot of them don't really need the prize money. It is possible that they're just trying new things out, but I think that Aurelion Soul is going to be a lot more popular than the Diana Nocturne deck. I don't think you're necessarily going to have a bad time if you run a triple aggro lineup. I think that the decks are good enough in their own right that you will beat non-Aurelion Soul lineups. But I mean, I've talked a lot about 3 aggro lineups in the past. I feel like there's not much more to say beyond the fact that they're kind of back. I mean, it's been a while since we've had one of those that, you know, really looked good. Zinc Elemental just got second at the last Duels of Runeterra with something like a 3 aggro lineup, but I would hesitate to call it that. But it definitely was one of the more aggressive 3 decks that we've seen in a while. So yeah, just be aware that 3 aggro lineups exist. If you play an Aurelion Soul deck, you could get picked on. That is one of the risks. I'm not necessarily saying that you have to prepare for that with the deck, because then you weaken your Aurelion Soul mirror matchup. And the reason it has to be 3 aggro decks is because you need to still have 2 aggro decks after your opponent bans one out so that you can still beat the Aurelion Soul decks. Just be aware that, like, it's okay to disrespect this lineup. It's possible that only, You know, if you have a 100-person tournament, maybe only 10 people bring 3 aggro, and that means you have a 10% chance of running into it. You can take that 1 loss in Swiss. You can even take 2 losses in Swiss a lot of the time and still make the top cut. We'll talk a little bit more about that next weekend when we see how much aggro has fallen off, because the early weeks of a meta are always infinitely more aggressive than the later weeks of the meta, because the control decks are a little bit harder to build, or rather they're a little bit harder to perfect. I'm sure you know what I mean when I say that. When looking at a tournament format, rather than judging the best deck by what has the highest win rate, you actually want to look at what's banned the most. And for the later half of patch 1.6, what was banned the most was overwhelmingly Frostbite midrange and Swain Twisted Fate. Swain Twisted Fate still has a phenomenal matchup into most decks in the format. A barreled up Make It Rain can absolutely decimate some early aggro boards, on top of the fact that the Swain Leviathan combo gets around Spell Shield because Swain Stun doesn't use the stack, as well as Riptide Rex still just getting through these weak boards of your opponent and pushing through a lot of damage. Sure, they have a lot of healing, but if you're dealing 20 to them in one turn, that doesn't really matter, which Swain Twisted Fate is capable of doing. The removal out of Targon decks is typically going to be exactly Sunburst, which does not kill Leviathan or a leveled up Swain, or it's going to be the Obliterate spells gotten off of Celestials, in which case it's more of a slow roll. The Swain Twisted Fate can kind of deal with that, especially because there's no great removal for the Twisted Fate himself. I have seen more Twisted Fates level against A-Soul decks than I have seen them level in my entire life. It's actually insane how easy it is to level up Twisted Fate against that deck, especially if you're running the Zap Spray Fins, the Triple Salvage, which we are overwhelmingly seeing out of Swain Twisted Fate. So then you think, what beats Swain Twisted Fate? The answer, in my experience, is actually Swain Trundle, which is another deck that I've been playing a lot on ladder. One of the big things is that Trundle has regeneration, which means he's extremely difficult for some of these decks to deal with. Now, I was playing Troll Chant in my version of the deck. Here we see Ian Agera, who won a tournament with this deck earlier this week. It was the Runeterra School, I believe, was the name of the organization that run it, but I don't actually know the name of the tournament. But with the changes to Frostbite midrange, I think that something like a Swain Freljord deck is a little bit more appealing. We were seeing a fair amount of Swain Sejuani at the end of patch 1.6, and I think that Swain Trundle is absolutely a great replacement for it. Now, there's a lot of different things that you can run in this deck. There's a couple of different versions running around. I think people are really starting to pick up on this, and if you do want to commit your Bilgewater elsewhere instead of Swain Twisted Fate, because that is a deck that's very likely to get banned, maybe you want to spread up your power regions a little bit, and I do think that Bilgewater could be considered a power region, especially, this is just Ian Agera's winning lineup, you know, obviously at the Lulu Shen down here, which I'll get into in a little bit, but the other big thing is he actually ran a Bilgewater Aurelion Soul deck, and Riptide Rex is still just as good a card as it has ever been. I don't think this Leona Aurelion Soul deck that Ian Agera brought is going to pop up a lot more. But anyway, back to the Swain Trundle. This deck actually just gets to do a lot of really cool things. Trundle sort of once again demands an answer like Swain and Leviathan do, especially once you get the pillar down and Trundle's just constantly ramping up his attack and picking apart your board. Overall, I really, really like this deck as a board control deck. You know, there's not a lot of Ruinations coming out of the format. We did see one out of Winding God in his Aurelion Soul deck, but outside of that, I mean, if people are committing their Shadow Isle to just be 3 unspeakable horror in a Aurelion Soul deck, I think that's maybe not the best use of Shadow Isle. I think that Deep is still a very good deck, especially with the addition of something like Stalking Shadows. But there's not a whole lot to say about that. I mean, Swain Leviathan is still just one of the best 2-card combos in the game. The fact that it has a good Aurelion Soul matchup is pretty cool. The one thing that I have noticed that I do want to warn you about, because I've pretty much only been playing Swain decks on ladder so far, in my experience, Swain Twisted Fate has the best spread of matchups. Swain Trundle can struggle with Aurelion Soul decks a lot more, but Swain Trundle does seem to do pretty well against Swain Twisted Fate. So that just kind of is what it is. That's like my personal analysis of how these decks actually play out. So take that with a grain of salt. But really, this comes down to, do I want to commit my Freljord elsewhere, or do I want to commit my Bilgewater elsewhere? And really, I do think that the Zombie Ash deck that we saw out of Nola Gold last week, and for the last couple of weeks out of Nola Gold specifically, still has a lot of good matchups into this format. I mean, you think about the fact that Spell Shield doesn't get around Frostbite because it doesn't use the stack, and you can still get off these big Ash OTKs. The decks aren't running a lot of removal, so your Ash Rhymefang Wolf gets to sit around and pick off the Celestials even. It just seems really good in my mind. Endure Spiders is obviously still one of the premier Shadow Isle Freljord decks, but honestly, I have seen nobody say anything about Endure Spiders. If we look at the GiantSlayer TV, I just kind of want to show you guys the decks that everybody's running. I'll also link this document in the description below, just so that you can kind of go through this. The only person that we see running anything close to Endure Spiders is Swim with this Mistwraith deck. It looks like it should be Endure Spiders, and then it's just not. It just runs a single copy of Omen Hawk instead. But this is like, you know, as close as I've seen to Endure Spiders thus far. It almost just looks like he forgot to put Endure in here, but And of course, you can't count out Ezreal in a tournament format. So we do have 2 players entering the Reckoning Fight Night with Karma Ezreal, Agigas, and Winding God. And I kind of wanted to just quickly go over the differences between their decks because they are very similar. Not much has changed in the Karma Ezreal world. Obviously, Whimsy came out, but people are still kind of trying that card out as Karma Ezreal can be weird to test on ladder. So we'll actually have to kind of track its tournament progress, which will be hard to do in North America because North America has typically shied away from Karma Ezreal in recent memory anyway. But I do think that Ezreal is a pretty good shot in the format. Of course, you are still worried about something like the 3 aggro Linux coming out of your opponent. We have seen Ezreal struggle with aggro as of late because you're more in on stun stuff than actually killing things, and that doesn't really work when your opponent's playing aggro. They're much more mana efficient. They're putting out more than 1 card a turn. And then on the side of Winding God, we actually see him make a little bit more of an aggro adaptation, puts Claws of the Dragon back into the deck, which has been absent for quite some time. Actually running 2 copies of Singular Will. Don't know if that one's going to stay in the meta, but we'll have to see how it goes. Doesn't actually put Whimsy in his deck, has Jury Rigs and Health Pots. So the difference between these 2 decks is really that Winding God has gone more anti-aggro, Agigas has gone a little bit more standard, and that's just something that you're going to have to accept. This deck is still in the format. And then over on the side of Swim, we still have Ezreal Twisted Fate. I think that this is probably the best deck to put your Bilgewater in if you're not running Twisted Fate Swain. I think if you do want to go like the Trundle Swain route, then Twisted Fate Ezreal is still very good. You kind of say, I want to play a board-centric 3-deck lineup. I think this is very fine. You know, Riptide Rex, still a very good card. Ezreal, still phenomenal. You guys know what Twisted Fate Ezreal does. I don't need to explain this to you. But Ezreal Twisted Fate does have a good Karma Ezreal matchup, so if you are, you know, kind of expecting people to still run that Karma Ezreal and think, oh, you know, this is a really good ASOL matchup, I can just stun out their units, I can drop Karma Ezreal if they ever drop ASOL, then you can play this to kind of punish that strategy. And then going back to this Brazilian tournament article, I just want to actually touch again on Lulu Shen. I think that this is a very powerful adaptation of the Vanguard Bannerman build. Because there are 8 regions now, it's a lot easier to sort of flex your regions around. I'm not necessarily sure that this is better than Shen Fiora. It's more aggressive than Shen Fiora, but baseline, I want to say that Shen Fiora actually has a lot of space to beat this, especially given how many low drops there are in the deck. You know, it's pretty easy to organically actually get to the Fiora win condition against a deck like this, I would feel. And because Fiora does get to beat up Lulu as well as Young Witch, like there's more 1/1s, I don't know, it just seems like Shen Fiora would do pretty well into this deck, though I could see this deck doing better into the meta. So if you are expecting a lot of people to run Lulu Shen, then, you know, you can go ahead and play that Shen Fiora, make a meta call, try to beat that one out, put in your single combats and concerted strikes and things like that, because we don't see really any defensive spells out of this deck. It's really just the 3 Rangers resolve. So as long as you can get your Fiora to the 4 attack breakpoint, you'll have no problem continuously cleaning up Lulus and War Chefs and things of that nature. So just something I kind of wanted to point out to you. When I say Bannerman, it's pretty likely that it's going to look like this. I haven't really seen anyone run Lulu elusives even on ladder. I don't think people are going to run it in tournament, but you do have to be aware of the existence of elusives because it is a new format. And overall, I think that that's one of the things you're going to see week 1 and not necessarily weeks 2 or 3. And then the one sort of deck that I've seen pop up on ladder that I wanted to touch on that isn't necessarily in anyone's tournament lineup because I've seen a lot of buzz about it is Teal Red's Targon Ezreal. If you don't remember Teal Red, he created the Harrowing Ezreal deck. So this guy just seems to be like the ladder Ezreal innovation guy, but like Harrowing Ezreal, I don't see this one really coming into tournaments. I think that there are much better regions to pair with your Ezreal than Targon for a tournament, and especially because, you know, we have 8 regions now, I'm sure you can find a better one than Targon to pair with it. It's not like you used up all your good Ezreal regions, but you're like, oh crap, I still want to use an Ezreal deck, and then I get stuck playing this. There's not a lot of removal in the deck. You're really focusing on Vi and Thermo Beam to take out some of the larger health units, like Swain decks provide. And I mean, it's possible that I've only been playing Swain decks, so I've been bodying this deck when I see it because it doesn't have great tools to deal with the Swain, especially if you're running Trundle Swain, which I think is what I was on when I ran into this deck. But TF Swain, overwhelmingly, looking at the Fight Night sheet, is the most popular deck in the format, which makes a lot of sense. There was a player in Asia who hit I think they were the first Asian master player who was only playing Twisted Fate Swain throughout their entire time. And, you know, Twisted Fate Swain being one of the best decks of last format, having good matchups across the board, it makes sense that that's kind of the deck to beat right now going into this opening weekend. I don't think that's going to change at all going into next weekend. We don't see any Frostbite midrange out of these players, but that is to be expected as it did just receive a couple of nerfs. So we'll have to actually see how Frostbite midrange comes back into the meta. But the point I was going to this actual slide for is because I don't think you have to worry about something like the Targon Ezreal coming into the tournament. But does it really matter what kind of Ezreal your opponent is playing? Be aware that your opponent is going to be playing an Ezreal deck most likely, bring a deck to beat that, you know, or ban it out, whichever. Just be aware that Ezreal still exists. For the love of God, I cannot express that Ezreal still exists. I don't care if you don't see it on ladder. Tournaments are different than ladder, and Ezreal's definitely proof of that. So as I had mentioned earlier, I think that the lineup that you're probably going to see the most is going to be like an Ezreal deck, a Swain deck, and an Aurelion Soul Allegiance deck. It doesn't really matter what region you want to pair with the Aurelion Soul. You could go Demacia, you could go Shadow Isle. I left it blank just to like represent that, you know, they can go a couple different ways with it. Could even be the Freljord ramp version. And that's kind of the cool thing about this lineup, is that no matter what other region you want to pair with the Aurelion Soul, the 3 main regions that we see paired with him are still open in a lineup like this. So I think that this is something that you could reasonably see over the course of the weekend. I think 3 aggro actually pairs very well into something like this, and that is one of the risks if you do want to bring a lineup like this. But I think this is just kind of like a knee-jerk reaction to like, this is something that I would run. And then a slight variation on that would be something like running the Twisted Fate Ezreal, the Swain Trundle, kind of just rearranging the way that your regions are played. But at the end of the day, this is still a Swain, Ezreal, and A-Soul lineup. So what would it look like if you weren't running something like that? What if we cut Targon from the lineup? Because I think that a lot of times players want to, going into the first weekend of tournaments, so like, you know what, I'm not even going to touch the new region. I don't think anybody knows how to play this properly. I'm going to play the old lineups and kind of see how that goes for me. And of course, you can still slot a Bannerman deck anywhere in here. And I think that's more of the adaptation that you're going to see, is just replacing the A-Soul deck with a Bannerman deck, because I still think that Ezreal is going to be popping up in more lineups than it's not. I still think that Swain is going to be popping up in nearly every lineup. I don't really see players replacing that, but if you wanted to just swap out the Ezreal deck here with a Bannerman deck, and then swap out the Targon deck with something like Deep Deck, I think that that's a very reasonable. Just to let you guys visualize it real quick. Again, just to help you visualize it, this is probably what something like that would look like if you didn't want to run an Ezreal deck and you didn't want to run a Targon deck. I think that it's pretty reasonable that people go that route. So these are kind of the 3 big lineups that I want you to expect going into this weekend. But as I mentioned, this is definitely take this as a practice weekend. I'm going to very closely look at the tournament results that happen over this weekend and the course of next week, and really try to hone in on a better sort of read on the meta going into the open qualifier weekend to help you get an invite into that invitational, because I want to see you succeed so badly. I want to cast you in these tournaments. Please let me help you do that. And yeah, you know, my advice, as always, take it with a grain of salt, because I'm really just going off of what I have available to me. As I said, I'm going to link the GiantSlayer Fight Night TV deck lists in the description below so that you can kind of go through those on your own. Maybe make some decisions about, this is what seems really popular here. This is what people are going to go for. I do think Swain Twisted Fate is 100% going to be the most popular deck on the weekend. I cannot understate how good that deck is right now. I love that deck. And then I know I had mentioned it earlier in the video, but I did want to visualize the 3 aggro lineup for you to remind you what that looks like. I think it would be something like Discard aggro, Nightfall aggro, and Scouts. So that's probably what a 3 aggro lineup looks like if players are going in looking to pick on your Aurelion Soul deck. These are the decks that I think you're going to have to prepare for with that A-Soul deck, because you cannot just get 2-0'd by something like that. Or you could just disrespect the lineup. Say, I don't think a lot of people are going to bring it, but if you do think this is going to be a significant portion of the meta, even like 20-30%, then I think if you are going to bring an A-Soul deck, you have to be prepared for this. Anyway, I hope that covered just about everything that I wanted to cover, everything that you needed covered going into this here tournament weekend. As I mentioned, it's actually surprisingly light for a tournament weekend, given that it is the release of a new set in Call of the Mountain, but the online league series will be firing off. That's a 1-day tournament on Saturday. Link to the Discord for that will be down below. Then you can sign up from there, things like that. I will be casting it this weekend along with SJW. Check that out, 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, I believe. If not, I'll figure that out and tweet it out. So follow me on Twitter from the BLVD. And as always, everyone, thank you so much for watching, and good luck in your tournaments.